Oh my gosh, sometimes it is like this. I had a video ready to go up live. It was all about a discussion kind of around the most recent patch and asking kind of where you guys are falling with it. I know there's been a lot of like negative sentiment from the community, so I was kind of breaking down the changes specifically to the Ruthless tier and trying to get a little bit of consensus here about how we're feeling. And I got to throw the whole thing out. I got to throw the whole video out because they just posted on Twitter. They said, "We've heard your feedback on Space Marine 2's 4.0 patch, and 4.1 will be implemented tomorrow. It will bring key balancing changes. Enemy spawns and difficulty tweaks are rolled back. Bolt weapons get buffs and more." And then they linked the full sort of article here that was written about it. So we're going to dive into this instead because a conversation about difficulty is kind of a moot point when tomorrow things are going to be changing. So I didn't want to have a video that immediately lost its entire relevance. So we're going to peruse this article together, and I'm just going to hit the main big points, and we'll cover the the things that stand out the most. Right out of the gate, Dimitri, the game director, is very outspoken about being grateful for all of the feedback. He says they've gotten negative feedback about the difficulty spike, they've gotten positive feedback about the new termination map, and he said just for all of it, we're so grateful to have this communication with the community. And we're so grateful that they're being really outspoken about what they like and what they don't like. Because ultimately, he says the takeaway for me personally is that I forgot that once the game comes out, it's no longer a dev's game, it's your game. And so this is huge. He goes on to say, this is why moving forward, we'd like to harness this energy by establishing public test servers. Yeah, you heard that right. They would let you try out major balancing updates and make your voices heard before these balances, these updates are pushed out into public branches. So we're hoping to make these available around early 2025, so stay tuned to our channels for more info. That's really interesting. Obviously, getting the community involved in playtesting changes in test servers before these changes go live for the full game. That's a great way to get early feedback, and it's a good way to prevent things like we had last week where there's just a ton of negative sentiment. I didn't feel as strongly about it negatively as most people did. I kind of have been enjoying the difficulty spike. I did have some minor complaints, and I did list them out in the video that was going to go live today, but it's no longer going to go live because it's irrelevant now. But let's move on. The next section of this article is really, really interesting to me, and it really does validate what I already suspected to be true. I suspected that before the 4.0 update that we got, I suspected that people were just casually walking through Ruthless, which was supposed to, at the time, be the hardest difficulty level. And people were just casually walking through it. We were soloing it. We were babysitting ammo crates and just staying in the same operation for an hour to 2 hours straight because we just couldn't die. We just sit there and farm kills, get 1,000, 2,000 kills. And it felt way too easy. And so this is what he says. He says, before patch 4.0, when the game came out in September, the Ruthless difficulty win rate hovered around 60%. But then weeks later, in the changes that were brought with patch 3.0, which made the game easier, he says that win rate jumped to over 80%. That's crazy that the hardest mode in your game, over 80% of the time, people are completing it with no difficulty, with no problem. And I think that's too much, right? And I agree with them there that needs to be reined in a little bit because at that point, the players who are looking for a genuine challenge don't have anywhere to go to get it. They have to start implementing their own challenge modes. They're like, okay, I can only use my melee weapon this run. If it's on your community to make a challenge in your game, then your game isn't challenging enough at the highest tier. So I really thought that they needed to make it more difficult, and they agreed. They said with patch 4.0, the one we just most recently got, they said our aim was to tweak enemy spawns to increase the overall number of enemies rather than reverting to buffing their health. Unfortunately, this had an impact on the easier difficulty levels as well. For example, the win rate on the easiest difficulty dropped slightly after 4.0 from 95% to 93%. This may not look like a lot, but numbers aren't everything. Your feedback made it clear that the game had become more intense and stressful on lower difficulties, and this was never our intention. As I've personally emphasized in interviews, Space Marine 2 is all about the power fantasy, and 4.0 negatively impacted it for many of you. So, yeah, the game got more difficult for people who like to play at the lower difficulties, and that kind of ruined things for them. And I've seen these comments, too, on my channel where people are like, I uninstalled after 4.0 because it just made the game grueling and unfun. But I like where he goes with this. He says that's why we're rolling back these changes. Extremist enemy spawn rates in minimal, average, and substantial difficulties will revert back to their pre-4.0 levels. Hey, this is great because it means that Ruthless isn't going to get heckin' nerfed. It says a little bit. So he goes on to say it will be slightly reduced in Ruthless difficulty to hopefully strike a balance between how hard the game was at launch and how easy it became in 3.0. I'd be fine if they kept them the way they are in Ruthless. I like a challenge in Ruthless because Ruthless is supposed to be like the hardest tier outside of, getting a team together and running Lethal, which has its own modifiers, which is a little bit of its own beast. But for general play, I want Ruthless to be a real challenge. Personally, I can't speak for you. But I hope they don't over-nerf it in Ruthless because I kind of like where the difficulty level's at right now in Ruthless. By the way, all of the gameplay in the video today is from the Ruthless tier. It was collected today and yesterday, so it's all very recent and has the 4.0, settings. The next section is about bolt rifles. He says they've been underperforming across all difficulty levels. This has been a frequent piece of feedback from many of you, and the data confirmed improvements were needed. So they are buffing the bolt weapons. We've got the auto bolt rifle is getting a damage increase of 20%, which is pretty big. Then you've got the bolt rifle, which is the one with the underbarrel grenade launcher variant. That one's getting a 10% damage buff. The heavy bolt rifle is getting a 15% buff, which is actually going to make the auto bolt and the heavy bolt much closer together. I think they're only going to be, if my math is right, only 1 to 2 damage apart in terms of damage. So you'll have a tougher choice there. The Marksman Bolt Carbine damage is going up 10%. Instigator Bolt up 10%. We've got Stalker Bolt up 10%. The Bolt Rifle, or the Bolt Sniper Rifle, which I'm a big fan of, that's going up 12.5%. The Bolt Carbine, SMG, up 15%. Oculus Bolt, which is similar to the Bolt Carbine, that's going up 15% as well. And then the Heavy Bolter is getting a 5% increase for the Heavy class. So that's a fair amount of damage that's going up across the boards. It's not going to dramatically swing anything against bigger targets, but I think that you're going to see these things being much more effective at general Minoris clearing than they are right now. Not that I actually really like a lot of the bolt rifles as they are in the game right now. I'm certainly not opposed to a buff, but I like them quite a bit as they are. I think they all kind of have their own niche. But the bolt, I think the ones that stand out the most are auto bolt getting a 20% increase. There's no other gun that's getting a buff that big. That's the biggest one. But then also the Bolt Sniper Rifle with that 12.5% is going to really help close the gap between that and the Las Fusel. I think those are the two that really rise to the top for me personally. Then we go on. We're going to talk more about difficulty. So Ruthless player armor is increased by 10%. So in the previous patch, they dropped our armor by 15% in Ruthless, and now they're buffing it another 10%. So it's sort of like 2 steps forward, 1 step. But it's like ping-ponging here a little bit to try and find the perfect number. So he says this: we are partially rolling back the change from the previous patch on Ruthless difficulty following your feedback. We're hoping to find the right compromise between how easy Ruthless was after 3.0 and how hard it felt last week. The reason why it was reduced last week was that we noticed a very substantial bump in win rates on Ruthless after 3.0, as Minoris enemies would no longer remove the entire armor bar with their attacks. This is true. So the game got way easier, when Minoris enemies weren't taking full health armor health bars, and we were getting full bars back for parrying their attacks. So our survivability skyrocketed after 3.0. So I personally didn't mind the 15% reduction to our armor that we got in 4.0, but apparently more people, the consensus said this feels bad. So I'm in the minority here, and I got to bow to the consensus. So we're going to go back up 10%. So not quite to where we were, but a net negative still. So hopefully it'll stay a challenge. And then here's something I am happy about. Lethal tight formation system is removed. Thank you. I did not care for that system. I would love if they found a different modifier to make lethal more challenging. But that one just felt bad in general because it broke class identity. Here's what he says about it. He says, before anything else, let's clarify our reasoning for the introduction of this mechanic. As we worked on adding a new difficulty tier, we needed to make sure this new challenge was meaningful and interesting. I agree. With tight formation, our objective was to add a new layer of challenge for our most skilled players by adding horizontal progression rather than just vertical progression, i.e. dealing more damage to ever stronger enemies. This game is about the power fantasy and enemies that take dozens of melee hits to break. It doesn't feel good, right? Thus comes the challenge. They needed to create challenge somewhere without just making bigger health bars and enemies. And I totally agree with that sentiment. I just didn't like tight formation. He says, this system was also designed as a first step towards the introduction of gameplay modifiers down the line. Great. I'm totally fine with new modifiers to shake things up. Says both negative and positive, something that World War Z players will be familiar with. Yep, if you've ever played that game, they made that one too. Said your feedback showed that the proximity requirements felt too restrictive. Classes like Assault and Vanguard felt especially penalized, as playing them effectively requires a certain freedom of movement. I agree, that was my issue with it. As a result, we're removing the system entirely and will continue to work on modifiers until they're ready. Thank you. We will continue to monitor your feedback after the deployment of patch 4.1 to make sure lethal difficulty feels as challenging and rewarding as it should. Excellent. I definitely would hope that sooner than later we get a new modifier in lethal. I don't want lethal to feel too easy. I don't want it to feel too similar to Ruthless. It needs to be its own unique identity, its own thing, its own challenge. So hopefully we get a good modifier in there that does create challenge like Tight Formation was designed to do, but it doesn't do it at the expense of class identity. In addition, they're also buffing our bots, so they deal 30% more damage to bosses. So if you like to solo queue or duo queue and you have a bot on your fire team and they feel useless in the Terminus fights, they're now gonna be doing 30% more damage. A little bit of a buff there. Zoanthropes, the shield swap cooldown, with another paired Zoanthrope is increased by 10%, so they're not going to swap as frequently. That can be really frustrating. I don't like fighting dual Zoanthropes, not because it's hard, but because it's annoying. It's like, I shoot you once and it swaps the shields. I shoot that guy once and it swaps the shields. It's like, okay, we get the idea. You shield each other. Why don't you just slow it down a little bit and let's make some progress here, especially when one of them is hiding around a wall and it's like, gosh dang it. It can be frustrating. So a little bit of a nerf there, nothing too major. And then this is interesting. So a lot of us noticed that our roll distance was shorter after 4.0, and it felt like they sort of stealth nerfed, the dodge roll. And they said it's a bug. So we fixed a bug that caused the roll distance to be shorter than before. So apparently that wasn't intentional. So they're reverting that as well. Other than that, they're fixing the bug with the lethal difficulty decals not being able to equip those, and some general crash and stability improvements as well. And that's about it. So, hey, there's actually a lot there. What do you guys think about that? We got the bolt rifle buffs. We've got Ruthless tuning. We've got the removal of Tight Formation. We've got making the lower difficulties much easier. Where are you at with all this? How do you feel about it? Let me know in the comments below. I'm always interested in hearing what you guys have to say, because a lot of times I see that my own personal opinions are not reflected by the majority, and I have to sort of bow to the consensus. So personally, I hope Ruthless stays hard. I kind of like that it's hard right now, and hopefully it stays that way. And I definitely hope that we get a new modifier in lethal sooner than later, so that can really feel like its own unique beast. But anyway, sound off in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching the video. Be warm and well fed, my friends. Courage and honor.